2.9 Expo is one of the hardest decks that you can learn in the game, but when mastered, is a super deadly archetype that can really trip up your opponents. So, how do you learn the deck? Well, of course, as with any other deck, it's good to start with the basics. Hey guys, Legendaray here, and today we are going to be doing a complete deck breakdown of the 2.9 Expo cycle. This will mainly be an Expo basics type video that will set you up to succeed with the 2.9 Expo. First, I will be taking a look at each card in the deck and going over its role in the deck. Then I will go over how to start off a match correctly, as well as how to finish off your matches. As for the middle game, the strategy really depends on which matchup you're facing, so I will gradually be making super in-depth guides on each and every matchup. Now before we get into the guide, be sure to leave a like on the video as well as a subscription to the channel, and check out my socials as well, links in the description. Any support that you can give greatly helps me out. So without further ado, let's get right into the guide. Specific card breakdowns. Expo. Now, in case you're wondering, Expo is the win condition of this deck. However, it's a card that has a ton of uses both on offense as well as defense. Let's go over the offense first. Firstly, when to play offensive Expos. Offensive Expos are usually played under 3 different situations. First, after a successful defense where you make a huge positive trade. Second, when you're confident that you have a big elixir advantage. And third, when your opponent makes a big commitment in the back. Now, let's go ahead and quickly go over the different Expo placements. Number 1, the default placement. This is the placement that you will use for 99% of your games. The Expo is as far over as you can, decreasing its range on the arena, making it a little bit harder for your opponents to distract. Number 2, centered on the bridge. This is a placement that I almost never use, but the only reason you would use this placement is if you have a surviving Tesla on defense and you want to use it to help defend the Expo. Number 3, Expo one tiled towards the center. This is a pretty special placement that I pretty much only use against a Golem matchup if they play the Golem in the back. This way, you not only apply pressure to the opposite lane of the Golem push, but to actually pull the Golem all the way to the opposite lane. This is also a placement you can use against a Lava Loon matchup if you are going opposite lane, which you normally shouldn't do anyway, but you can actually separate the balloon from the Lava Hound with a super high Tesla placement like this, and just basically pull the whole thing opposite lane. Number 4. Expo at the very center of the bridge. This is another placement that I also very rarely use. The most common usage of this placement would be for if your opponent already has a tower down and you're going on offense in that same lane. This way, the Expo is going to be a little bit closer to your towers and will provide a bit more protection. Now on defense, there are 3 main placements that you should get familiar with. The first is the anti-fireball position. Of course, play it on the side with more tower health, and it's 3 tiles from the river. This way, your opponent can't get any fireball value onto your weaker tower. It is used when your opponent is running either the fireball or the rocket, commonly against matchups such as bait or other Expo decks. The second placement is an anti-lightning, anti-poison, and anti-earthquake placement. Now there are 2 different placements for this. The first is with one corner kind of overlapping the tower, and the second is 1 tile towards the center and 1 tile up. I find myself using the farther back placement a lot more often. The one towards the center I will generally only use when I'm trying to snipe something such as a furnace. Now generally, I use this placement when my opponent places something high elixir in the back and you don't want to push opposite lane. The most common situation is probably a matchup such as P.E.K.K.A. Control, where you often have to rely on those defensive Expos in that anti-poison position to try and set up for an Expo on offense. Tesla. Tesla is the other building in this deck, and again, it's also used on both defense and offense, although for a majority of the time, the Tesla will be placed on defense. Now, for defense, there are a few placements that you can use. The first placement is a Tesla 4 tiles from the river. This is the farthest placement that will pull all major tanks, including Royal Giants, Giants, Golems, and the Goblin Giant. Now, against Golem, if they place a tank in the back and your Expo is out of cycle, immediately place your Tesla and try and cycle to a second one in case they have the lightning spell. Against most other tanks, you will just play the Tesla right as the tank crosses the bridge. Number 2. Tesla 3 tiles from the river. This is a placement mainly for troops such as the Ram Rider, the Hog, and the Battle Ram. This is also the placement that I will use when I'm just straight up placing the Tesla down on defense to defend something such as a baby dragon or a bandit in worst case situations. Number 3. Now another interesting placement is to place the Tesla closer to an Expo that you use on offense as a way to defend. This is mainly used for Giant as well as Lava Hound matchups. For Giant, you want to save the Tesla's health and cycle back to another Expo while the Tesla's still alive, essentially outcycling their Giant. Against a Lava Hound deck, you're just trying to take out the Lava Hound as well as the support troops that they place behind it. Oftentimes, if you go Expo same lane into the Lava Hound, the support troops will go around it, giving you a much easier time to target it with the Tesla. Now on offense, I usually play the Tesla a bit farther over, 1 tile from the Expo. This gives you more room to play distraction units to protect the Expo. However, if your opponent uses more ranged units to counter the Expo, I will play it directly next to the Expo. That being said, I don't actually use offensive Teslas that much, especially in single elixir, as it's an expensive 4 elixir card that will greatly slow down your cycle. So again, use those offensive Teslas only when you have a decent elixir advantage. Ice Golem. Ice Golem is another super critical card in this deck. Why? Because it's the only tank type troop. So this is a card that you have to use effectively on both offense and defense. Furthermore, it's a 2 elixir cycle card, so it's also a card that you can just cycle in the back at full elixir. Now on defense, this card has 3 main usage. The first is to distract troops, either just as a tank or to kite them to the opposite lane. The second is to tank for the Tesla and supporting units such as archers, allowing them to maximize damage output while keeping as much health as possible. Finally, the Ice Golem is your go-to to tank for splash units as well. Since the majority of the troops in this deck are rather squishy, it's super important that you have your Ice Golem in cycle for your opponent's splash units. Now, if your Ice Golem survives with enough health, you can play something such as just skeletons behind it, making for a super cheap 1 elixir push that will not only advance your cycle by 1, but also deal some tower damage if not defended. Now, offensive Ice Golems are a lot simpler. They're mainly used to tank for your Expos, and for most melee units, this placement will be the best, distracting the units while putting them in range of the tower. For ranged units, however, you will usually have to be a little more predictive, so you play him only when you know one of those cards is in cycle. Archers. These are your main support troops, covering a majority of air and ground portions of the deck. Now, it's a 3 elixir card, so oftentimes it's okay to just cycle them in the back as well. On defense, they can be placed in the center to kite on their own, or against bigger units, you can use an Ice Spirit or an Ice Golem to tank for the archers. That being said, you do really want to protect those archers. They are the highest DPS unit in your deck, so you want to try and keep them alive as much as you possibly can. Again, although 90% of the time you will be splitting them, against spells such as lightning, you don't actually have to split them on defense. Also, while defending big pushes, I also won't split archers. Instead, I'll play them in the far corner. This way, they will be separated from something such as a center-planted Tesla, preventing your opponents from getting too much spell value. Oftentimes, they'll have to pick and choose, either take out the archers or take out the Tesla. Now on offense, if you have a surviving archer with a tiny bit of health, you can add something such as an Ice Spirit in front of the archer. This will force out an actual response from your opponent, or will guarantee a few hundred damage onto the tower, all for just 1 extra elixir. Also, when playing archers reactively to support the Expo, you have to be very careful not to give too much spell value. So be sure they're either low on elixir, or they have just used their big spell. Fireball. This is the big spell in your deck, so be sure to use it very wisely. That being said, unless you're facing Fireball bait, you can be rather aggressive with your Fireball considering how fast your cycle is. Now my general rule is this: if your troop is worth 4 or more elixir and is weak to fireball, I will usually fireball it with the tower. Also, on offense, one thing that I like to do is fireball a unit they put down to distract if they are placed in the same lane. If you damage down a distraction unit faster than they can expect, you can often get a sneaky Expo lock onto their tower, and your opponent just simply won't have enough time to react. However, be careful not to overcommit. It is a 4 elixir card after all. Now on defense, you would use this spell as expected, making sure to get as much value as possible. Also, be sure to use the fireball's knockback to your advantage, making sure to always knock units away from the tower. The fireball is also kind of another pseudo win condition for the deck, as towards the end, you can choose to fireball cycle your way to a win. Also, 2 fireballs and 1 log do 484 damage to a tower at tournament standard, so once you get a tower down to that number, you basically have the win secured, cause you can cycle those cards insanely fast. Log. The log is of course the small spell in this deck. Since this deck does cycle relatively fast, just like the fireball, you can be a bit more aggressive with the log. Also, being only 2 elixir, it will be another cycle card in the deck. Now other than that, the log is a pretty simple card to use. There's not too much to it. It can be used to take out small units, as well as logging units backwards, which sometimes can be used on offense, such as to knock a musketeer back, or on defense, such as to knocking a tank back, allowing a mega minion to travel in front. I'm usually not using predictive logs as much, as they can be more risky, so I'll only do it if the opponent is consistently using the same thing over and over against the Expo. Ice Spirit. Now onto the true cycle cards in this deck, starting off with the Ice Spirit. The Ice Spirit is a card that can be played truly for cycle, but also as a chip card as well, because not only does it advance your cards for just 1 elixir, but it also guarantees 91 damage onto the tower if left ignored. Therefore, this is one of the cards that I am okay with just playing at the bridge. That being said, it also is your only way to reset cards such as Inferno Tower and Sparky, so against those matchups, be sure to save the Ice Spirit for those cards specifically. Other than that, Ice Spirit also does splash, meaning that it can be a semi-counter to swarms on defense as well. You can also play it similar to an Ice Golem to distract melee units coming towards the Expo. Finally, the Ice Spirit is also critical against the Barbarian Barrel, because if you time that Ice Spirit just right, it will tank 1 shot from the Barbarians and then proceed to freeze it. Skeletons. And last but certainly not least, we have these Skeletons. This is a card that seems very simple on the surface, but definitely can become very technical the more advanced you go with this deck. Of course, being a cycle card, you can just cycle it in the back when you're at 10 elixir. However, on defense and sometimes on offense, it does have some very specific uses. One major skill you should try and master is surrounding units with skeletons. It's actually a lot more difficult than you think, as many units are pretty big and do splash damage. Now what this troop really excels at is distraction against single targeting troops, such as P.E.K.K.A. or the Prince. On defense, you can kite those units over with those skeletons, and it takes a long time for these units to get taken out, providing your tower some super valuable time to provide some critical damage on defense. The same applies on offense, playing them to distract some melee units for just some time. That being said, they can be zapped out quite easily, so be sure to have some of your other defensive cards ready. Starting off a match correctly. Alright, so now that we've broken down each card individually, let's go over how to start off a match with the Expo. Honestly, starting off a match with the Expo is pretty simple. You keep cycling all your cheap units over and over and over again without leaking any elixir whatsoever. This does 2 things. 1, it will guarantee some chip damage onto your opponent's towers, and 2, it will cause your opponents to make the first commitment and cycle some of their cards in return. This is super valuable because in an Expo deck, it's super important to determine what deck you are up against before making the first big move. See what your opponent's win conditions and support cards are, as well as which spells they are running, and from there, adjust appropriately depending on the matchup. Now, another major part of this deck is card counting. It's a skill that takes a long time to master, but is insanely valuable. In fact, some of the best players in Clash Royale know exactly what your opponents have in hand at all times. However, if you're not at that level yet, what I often like to do is to just keep track of one card. Usually it's the biggest counter to the Expo. To do that, just know that once you play a card, you have to play 4 more cards to cycle back to it. For example, in a giant matchup, always keep track of whether your opponent's giant is in cycle. In a bait matchup, see if your opponent's rocket is in cycle, and so on and so forth. Eventually, it'll become second nature, and it will definitely greatly improve your gameplay. Ending the game. Okay, so you've determined the matchup, and the game timer is slowly winding down towards overtime. Congratulations, you're hopefully in a good situation, but either way, for any deck, it's super important to know how to attack a game as you approach the end of a match. With Expo, there are 3 different things you can do. Continue doing what you're doing, go for a draw, or spell cycle. Let's take a look. Expo lock. So, you're in double elixir time, approaching overtime now. So, for a majority of the time, just continue doing what you've been doing for the entire match. After all, oftentimes, one Expo lock will be enough to bring your tower down pretty low, down to spell cycle range. This is generally what you will do against easy to medium matchups. Just keep doing what you've been doing and try and break through. Again, all you need to do in the end game is to bring that tower down to spell cycle range and you're all set. Draws. On the flip side, if you're not able to break through at all by the start of overtime, it may be time to consider taking a draw, especially against a difficult matchup such as Royal Giant or Golem. In this case, it's still okay to play offensive Expos, but again, do not overextend on offense. Offensive Expos are only used to try and break apart your opponent's push so that they just can't steamroll you with an absolutely overwhelming push. Defensive Expos are always key in draws, so be sure to use those effectively. In addition, by playing more defensively, it can oftentimes cause your opponents to accidentally overcommit, allowing for you to get that one Expo connection. Spell cycling. Spell cycling is another important part in 2.9, especially to finish off matches. So, when should we do it? Well, I usually recommend spell cycling when you've already taken a tower down somewhat low, about around half health, and you just can't break through when you're around double elixir time. Now with Expo, it's often just better to log cycle. After all, log is a super cheap and inconsequential card to cycle, and it won't be that big of a commitment. Now of course, if you can get fireball value against a tower, then definitely take it, but for the most part, I wouldn't recommend straight out fireball cycling until you are about 2 fireballs away, again, about 484 damage on the tower. Fireball cycling is a pretty huge commitment, and not only is it a waste of 4 elixir, but it's also a waste of a super valuable defensive card, so be very careful about deciding when to fireball cycle. Alright, so that's all I have for this introductory episode of Expo 2.9. If you found this video helpful, be sure to leave a like on the video as well as subscribe to my channel. It really does make a big difference as to how my channel does. On the end screen when it comes out will be my in-depth guide on how to beat Golem, so if you're interested, be sure to check it out. But unfortunately guys, that's all I've got time for in today's episode. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below as well as a subscription to my channel, and as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.